Welcome to the carbon cap and trade debate.
I never raised my hand.
It's a great evening. Anytime such a large group of citizens are gathered together to discuss an important topic. I am Trent England with the Freedom Foundation. This debate is organized by the Freedom Foundation and brought to you by the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, which is a foundation that sponsors public debate programs like this, and that shares the belief with the Freedom Foundation that the whole idea of democracy, the whole idea, like it says at the beginning of our state constitution, all political power is inherent in the people, is a myth if the people are not informed and empowered to actually do that, to actually run government. And this program is actually on a topic that the Freedom Foundation doesn't typically talk about, doesn't typically work on, but it's something that I think all citizens of Washington State recognize is important and it's timely, and we thought there was no better place in Washington State to bring together a group of experts and hold a meeting like this. We will be producing this video and releasing it around the state so that other people can benefit from this conversation as well. So be thinking about really good questions, because your job is to help suss out these issues for many other people, not just tonight, but around our state. I want to tell you a little bit about the Freedom Foundation, and then I will tell you a little bit about our panelists, and then I will turn the program over to them, and they will make their remarks fairly quickly so that we have plenty of time for questions from all of you. The Freedom Foundation was founded in 1991, so about 22 years ago, and we were created with the idea that I mentioned a moment ago, that this whole idea of democratic government and individual rights and accountability, those are all just words. As James Madison would have said, parchment barriers, right? This is all just parchment barriers unless somebody actually does something about it. And so the Freedom Foundation works on issues like government transparency. We're part of the Washington Coalition for Open Government. We have teams of policy analysts and attorneys and reporters who look at government, look at what government is doing, and then unlike a traditional think tank that sees, sort of producing a book or a white paper as some sort of an accomplishment, we don't view the policy process that way. We think that the accomplishment is taking information out to the people of our state in a way that they can actually put that information turn it into action, turn it into informed citizen action. And so we have a team of, I'll call them community organizers, who travel around our state and train people and educate people and work with citizens to help them become more involved and to actually put the truth into that statement at the beginning of our state constitution. I guess I would be remiss not to mention two things about this. I think we're the only group that publishes a pocket-sized Washington State Constitution. You can find that on our website. You do have to have a somewhat robust pocket, but this is Bellingham. You guys have cargo shorts and things like that, so you can do it. You can find this on our website. Also, at the end, we did give everyone a Connect card. If you have, we'll pick all those up at Q&A, whether you have a question or not. If you have a question, write it on the back of that card. But if you turn that in, we'll draw a few of those out, and I have some Washington State Constitutions, and just in case those are not inducement enough, I don't know why that would be the case, we also have iTunes gift cards. So as our inducement to you to connect with us, right at the end of the program, I'll give a few of those away. We are very fortunate to have what I think is a great panel of people to talk about an environmental issue, a policy issue, a political issue. We have people here who know about cap and trade and climate issues more generally from all of those perspectives. Senator Doug Ericksen, who hails from right here in Whatcom County, is the chairman of the Senate Energy, Environment, and Telecommunications Committee. He has been elected, was elected 6 times to the State House of Representatives here in the 42nd District in Whatcom County, and is just finishing his first term in the State Senate. He has degrees from Cornell University and a degree in, I believe it was environmental science, is that right? From right here, Western Washington University.
Science loosely.
Science loosely, science generally. So he is very well prepared to talk about these issues with us here. Daniel Simmons is here from the other side of the country. We're very grateful that he endured a 5.5-hour plane ride to be here with us today. He is the Director of Regulatory and State Affairs at the Institute for Energy Research. He, like me, holds a JD from George Mason University School of Law and also a degree in economics from the Utah State University. He's a former research fellow at the Mercatus Center, which is also at George Mason University. Dr. Yoram Bauman, we can clap for all of them. Everyone gets a ribbon here. We'll see if they clap at the end of the program. Dr. Yoram Bauman is the stand-up economist. He is both an economist and a comedian. The dismal science, putting life in the dismal science, I guess. He's an instructor down at the University of Washington. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Washington and a degree in mathematics from Reed College down in Portland. Finally, on the far left over here, except for me, which makes me feel a little bit concerned, but we have Representative Joe Fitzgibbons. Very glad that he joined us. He is the chairman of the House Environment Committee and just finishing his first term in the second term in the Washington State House of Representatives, representing the 35th Legislative District, 34th Legislative District, which is Burien, West Seattle, White Center, Vashon, and Maury Islands. And I know this is an issue that he cares a lot about. So we are going to start our program with 7-minute opening statements, and we're going to begin with Dr. Bauman.
Terrific. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming out. Thanks to the Freedom Foundation for sponsoring this event. I believe it or not, I make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics. So, thank you. That wasn't a punchline, but I am gonna stand up, and I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna start with a joke. I'm gonna show you my T-shirt. It's my. You can give capitalism a round of applause. That's okay. So the T-shirt was this is my Enjoy Capitalism T-shirt. So made in China. If you look at the tag on the back, it's actually 80% cotton and 20% irony. So I did live in China in 2011. I lived there for 5 months. I figured if I was going to work on climate change issues, I should know something about China. So I got an apartment and finagled a university position in Beijing. I want to show you the view. This is a little bit of a washed out view of from my housing complex in Beijing. I lived in a housing complex that houses 400,000 people. And this is what it looked like about 5% of the time you could actually see the sky. Much more often, the view from my apartment window looked like that in the middle of the day. Yeah, so pretty serious pollution problems in China. Now, these pollution problems are not directly connected to climate change, right? Local air pollution is different than global air pollution, but they're both related to fossil fuel consumption, from vehicles and factories and things like this. So I'm actually going to share with you now the same little pitch that I do when I do college and corporate events. I do a bunch of comedy and a little bit of serious climate stuff. So I'm going to share with you what I share with those groups. We're going to start with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. I think nobody really doubts this. Nobody doubts that this is primarily caused by human activity, principally burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. Now this theory actually predates Al Gore. Actually, they laughed at that joke more in Texas. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who's a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more worried about sort of changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so. And here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years. The red bars here are 10-year average temperatures from the 1880s going up through the 1970s. And then there's the 1980s. There's the 1990s. There's the 2000s. For what it's worth, there's the first couple years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Now, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote innovation and conservation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. So what I work on as an environmental economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system that we're going to get into more tonight. But the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. Now, this is generally the part in my talk where people stop laughing, right? Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this, but there is a side benefit to these policies, other than the main benefit of, like potentially saving the planet. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. I'm sure you all have your own ideas about what the government can do with a pile of revenue. But the idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting or revenue neutral tax swaps. Right, the idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like carbon emissions, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. And this is an idea that actually has bipartisan support from economists across the political spectrum, including both of Mitt Romney's chief economic advisors, as well as folks like Paul Krugman on the left. And it even has some support among folks who don't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures. So George Will, some of you may know George Will, pretty conservative columnist, came to one of my classes a few years ago. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. And with unemployment at 6 or 7%, I hate the payroll tax. Right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. In any case, like I said, economists across the political spectrum think this is a good idea, and there's even a place that's done this. So the best climate policy in the world is just to our north, in British Columbia, implemented by a right-of-center government that said, look, we want to do something about climate change, we don't want to grow government, we want to be market-friendly. They implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So yes, they pay 25 cents a gallon more for gasoline. Yes, some of them come down here to Bellingham and buy gas at Costco. But in exchange for paying more for gasoline, folks in BC also have the lowest personal income taxes in Canada. They have the lowest corporate income tax rates in the G7 group of rich democracies. So we can see how that's working. Petroleum sales are down in British Columbia, so they're reducing carbon emissions by 10 or 15%. Only a small fraction of that is because they're coming down to Whatcom County. I just wrote an article about this on the Sightline blog if you're interested in seeing that. We can also look at how the economy is doing in BC. It's doing just as well as the economy in Canada as a whole. To give you a sense of how this might work in Washington State, right, if we had the same kind of carbon tax that they have in British Columbia, we could reduce the state sales tax by a full percentage point. That would save the average household in Washington State hundreds of dollars a year. So the idea that I'd like to share with you is if we had higher taxes on carbon emissions, then we could afford to have lower taxes on other things like sales taxes. So yes, you'd pay a couple $100 more a year for fossil fuels. You'd pay a couple $100 less a year for everything else. And I think that's a strong trade-off, and it's valuable, and it provides benefits to us both in terms of climate and in terms of the economy. Thank you.
Representative Fitzgibbon.
Thank you, Trent. And Yoram is a tough act to follow, but I will give it my best shot. I wanted to talk with you a little bit today about the idea that Governor Inslee has put forward that we would institute a cap and trade proposal here in Washington State, which is the fundamental idea there is that we would have a firm legal cap and say we are not going to burn more greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuels than this amount, which is the amount that climate scientists tell us we need to reduce our emissions to in order to have a safe climate going into the future, and that the permits for polluting can be traded so that the firms that can reduce their emissions most cheaply are the ones who do it, and that the firms that it would be more expensive to do, the households, the businesses, would instead get to buy a permit from someone that can reduce their emissions more cheaply. That's the core idea of cap and trade. It's the way that we reduced sulfur dioxide emissions in this country 25 years ago, and it's an idea that a lot of jurisdictions around the world have pursued and that have found that it's an economically efficient way to make this change. So, to talk about Governor Inslee's cap and trade proposal is a challenge because it's not an actual proposal yet. A couple weeks ago, the governor assembled a task force of 21 individuals from across the political spectrum to put together a cap and trade proposal for the legislature to consider in January. And they have just now begun their work. There isn't a proposal on the table for us to consider, so we're talking in very vague terms about something that that Doug and I and others in the legislature will have the chance to look at in January and decide whether it works, how to make it better, whether to move forward with it. I think that there's a lot of potential in this idea, and I wanted to mention some of the things that I think are valuable about the idea that we could grow our economy and reduce our emissions at the same time in much the way that Yoram described. The problem that our state faces is we have two core problems here. How do we grow our economy, and how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to a safe level for our kids and our grandkids? We're in a unique position in this state. We're uniquely blessed with a lot of natural resources, with farms and forests and cheap hydropower, and we also don't have a lot in the way of fossil fuels. We're not a state that is like North Dakota that has a whole lot of oil reserves. We're not a state like Wyoming that has a lot of coal reserves. So what we have is an economy that's dependent on sending our money out of state to other states, to other countries, to buy energy, when instead there are opportunities for us. If we could get the technologies further along, we have opportunities to have our farms and our forests provide us power to power our economy, keep our dollars local, support our local economies, and at the same time end up with a cleaner economy as a result. I think we can do that. I think we can find the way to grow our economy and also reduce our emissions and keep our dollars local at the same time. I want to talk about a couple of the ways that I think Whatcom County in particular could see huge benefits from this. You may know that here in Bellingham is the biggest solar manufacturer in the state, iTech Energy. That's one of the businesses that could see a real growth in their market as we move towards cleaner energy. You also have you're blessed with a lot of dairy farms. This is as you all know, this is the biggest dairy producing county in the state. One of the aspects of a cap and trade proposal that could come together, again, we don't have a proposal yet, we don't know if this is going to be part of it, but I think it probably should be, is that as you have anaerobic digesters on dairy farms, which is a device that can turn cow manure into energy, under California's cap and trade system, which they've been in the process of developing for the last 10 or so years, dairy farms can sell the carbon credits from the anaerobic digesters to businesses. Businesses will buy their credits so that those businesses can continue to burn fossil fuels. There's a huge market out there. There's a huge market here in Washington. There's a huge market in California for carbon credits that businesses can buy from dairy farms here in Whatcom County to create a new steady stream of income that's not reliant on the price of milk, that can help farms stay in business, which is, I think, something I think is worth doing. We can grow those businesses, we can keep our economies local, and we can create new markets that help some of the industries that have been that have declined over the last couple of years. I think we all know that farms are struggling to stay in business. We know that the timber products industry has struggled to stay in business. We know that the construction industry was hit harder than just about any other sector in the recent economic downturn. by having a cap and trade proposal that incentivizes new technologies that help us reduce our emissions, those industries, which are the ones that most need help right now, are the ones that can benefit. So we're going to be very careful as we look at this proposal, because it's a big proposal. It could mean a lot of a lot of growth and also a lot of impacts. And the legislature has considered a cap and trade proposal before, back in 2009. As Doug will recall, Governor Gregoire at the time brought forward a cap and trade proposal, and the legislature decided the time wasn't right for it because they hadn't thought it out enough. There weren't enough places that had gone ahead with it and seen the benefits. We're a couple years down the road, we've seen other jurisdictions go ahead with the cap and trade, and they've benefited. They've thrived. In California now, electrical ratepayers get a credit on their electrical bills 2 times a year, if not based on how much electricity they use, but a straight $35 credit twice a year. The money that we develop from a carbon tax or from a cap and trade proposal can be reinvested in our economy in a whole lot of different ways. Yoram described a couple of those ways, and I know that as we go into the legislative session in 2015, we're going to want to hear from you and from everybody in the state about how you think that those revenues can be best reinvested in our state. If we should lower tax rates, if we should invest in our schools, what we should do with it. I think that can have great benefits in reducing our pollution and in growing our economy at the same time. So again, thank you very much for having us. This is a great topic for us to explore, and I appreciate you taking the time on a beautiful sunny night to come talk with us about it.
Okay, Mr. Simmons.
All right. Again, thanks for coming out, and thanks to the Freedom Foundation for getting me out here. I grew up in Utah, and I miss the West a lot after having lived in Washington, D.C. for the last 16 years. But the reason that I'm in Washington, D.C. is because I care about policies, and I care about environmental policy, and I think that cap and trade is one of the most harmful and cruel of policies that are currently being discussed. As Yoram said, well, one of the things that he said is that the point of cap and trade is to increase the cost of using natural gas, coal, and oil. That's the point. That's the way that you incentivize people to use other sources of energy. And so these costs are very real. As Paul Krugman, an economist who writes for the New York Times, definitely left of center, said, "Yes, limiting emissions will have its cost. As a card-carrying economist, I cringe when green economy enthusiasts insist that protecting the environment will be all gain and no pain." And the problem is that the people, to me, is who feels the greater incidence of this pain. If you make more than $50,000 a year, you spend about 8% of your income on energy costs. If you make between $30,000 and $50,000 a year, that more than doubles to over 15% of your income goes to energy costs. If you make between $10,000 and $30,000 a year, you spend 1/5 of your income in energy. And so when we talk about these plans, such as cap and trade, where the point is to increase the cost of energy, we're making life more difficult for people, because energy is one of the major inputs into the economy. Anytime that we make it more expensive, when we make transportation more expensive, when we make electricity more expensive, we are making it more difficult to grow the economy and to get the economy really going again. And so cap and trade, the point is to increase the cost of using energy. How much will that be? I mean, again, there isn't a fully fleshed out proposal here in Washington, so we don't know. One touchstone to think about is the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill that passed the U.S. House of Representatives about 5 years ago. Governor Inslee voted for it when he was in the House of Representatives. That would have required a 50% reduction. I lied. A 42% reduction by 2030, and in 2030 that would cost families about $1,200 in lost disposable income and 50,000 jobs here in Washington by 2030. Now, what will Washington's plan be? I don't know. The point is, though, that the costs are real and they're unavoidable because, well, they're the point. And so, like, those are the costs, and in everything that we do in life, we don't just consider the cost, we also weigh it against the benefits. We might do things that are very costly if we think that the benefits outweigh them. And here's the problem. They don't. And the point of cap and trade is to affect climate change, to affect the temperature. If we have lower temperatures, then we'll have less of the problems that we associate with climate change. So if Washington were to today eliminate carbon dioxide emissions completely from the entire state, you know, some new magic technology is developed tonight, you know, what would the reduction in temperature be? Well, by 2100, so 85 years down the road, temperatures would be about 0.02 of a degree less. And then that's a complete wipeout from today. Now, cap and trade isn't going to achieve all those benefits. I mean, all those reductions. Now, that, you know, these numbers, they come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That is like the scientific consensus body. So those benefits are incredibly small. Since we're here in Bellingham, we're right here at sea level, what will the reduction in sea level rise be? Well, about 1/100th of an inch reduction. So in other words, if you're talking about a temperature difference of 0.02 of a degree, that's not large enough to have any climatic benefits, any climatic impacts. So this point I can't stress it enough, is that there are no benefits, there are no climatic benefits to Washington imposing a cap and trade system. And the reason, which as Yoram pointed out, being in China, is that as large as Washington is, as large as the US is, you have developing countries around the world where you have hundreds of millions of people that don't have access to electricity. Much of this electricity is going to come from coal, and we're going to have dramatically increasing carbon dioxide emissions. Currently, China uses about half the world's coal, and that will only increase, especially because in India there is a couple 100 million people that don't have access to electricity, or at least secure access to electricity. So lastly, one more reason that I am anti-cap and trade is that cap and trade proponents, such as the governor, apparently don't believe in cap and trade. The point of cap and trade is that you have a cap, and then you're able to, you know, the various people, various companies are able to trade the emission reductions in order to get below the cap, stay below the cap. So if it's more efficient to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in the transportation sector, for example, then they will be able to reduce those emissions in transportation and sell them to like electricity generation or industry. But the problem is that the governor, for example, just this week was talking about a low carbon fuel standard. This is imposing regulations on top of a cap and trade system, will make the cap and trade system less efficient and more costly. So in conclusion, the costs of cap and trade are real and large. They're unavoidable. They're the point. And the benefits when it comes to climate are incredibly minuscule. And then cap and trade's proponents don't apparently believe in it. So therefore, why do we need it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Ericksen.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Let's tuck the back, clean up in this batting order here. Very interesting stuff. Hate to follow economists because it's always difficult to argue with them, you know, on all the stats that they'll throw out at you. Thank you all for coming out tonight, spending a Wednesday evening here in Bellingham with us to talk about a very important issue. I'd like to kind of frame the context of my comments tonight about one key issue. And that key issue is we are in the middle of an energy revolution in America. And oftentimes when you're in the middle of an energy revolution like we are in America, you don't quite realize it. We're not talking about being the Saudi Arabia of coal anymore. Coal's over here. Hold that one constant for a second, even take it off the table. We're becoming the Saudi Arabia of oil. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. Industrial jobs are leaving China to come back to America because of low-cost natural gas in our country. It's an amazing time in the energy world here in America. A few years ago, the people of Washington passed Initiative 937 called the Energy Independence Act. That initiative pales in comparison to what's happening with energy independence due to what's happening with regards to oil and natural gas in America when it comes to real energy independence in North America. It's amazing. And I think it really adds context to everything that we're talking about here with regards to cap and trade. First off, it's hard to be for or against Governor Inslee's cap and trade proposal because Governor Inslee has not put out a cap and trade proposal yet. It's hard to be against the Democrat proposal because there wasn't one. It's hard to be against the Republican proposal because there wasn't one. After we went through the Climate Legislative Executive Work Group process last year, I came forward with a couple of ideas. It's kind of ironic that I was the only one to actually propose climate change legislation with regards to nuclear energy in the legislature last year, which was the only major piece of legislation that came forward to look at climate issues, carbon issues in North America or in Washington State. But we'll continue working on that through the legislative process to get to a point that works for America and works for Washington. A couple of stats we have to talk about, and Mr. Simmons hit a couple of them, but Washington State is such and I'm going to talk about Washington State in specific because we're talking about a Washington State cap and trade program. Washington State is such a small carbon producing region. I think that we should pat ourselves in the back and be happy and take advantage of it and use that as a way to create jobs in Washington State and not use it as this way to say we're going to punish ourselves by trying to achieve an artificial level. And let's put it into context for 1 second. If you all stop breathing, if we stop all carbon production in Washington State, China and India will increase their carbon production, increase enough to replace all carbon produced in Washington State in 1 month. And then they'll do it the next month. And they'll do it again the next month after that. And they'll do it again the next month after that. So to put it into context of world carbon production, what we do in Washington State, between 1/10 and 1/5 of 1% of world carbon comes out of Washington. So let's just keep that in mind as we have the conversation and talk about what we need to do in Washington State. If we were to reduce our carbon by 25% below 1990 levels, think about that one for a second, reduce our carbon by just 25% below 1990 levels, China and India would replace that in 1 week. And then replace it the week after that, and replace it the week after that, continually going forward. So if you believe carbon is the issue, Washington reducing by 25% is not the solution. And that's one of the things I think we need as legislators, people who are here to protect jobs, expand our economy, and keep people working, need to be aware of that also as we go forward. That's a very important part of what we have to be talking about. Last year we did create what's called the Climate Legislative Executive Work Group. It was prime sponsored by Senator Ranker, who represents the 40th District, came through my committee. We put together 4 legislators and the governor to look at issues with regards to how we can have a cost to benefit analysis of carbon reduction mechanisms in Washington State. And one of the things we agreed to do was not debate the science. We weren't going to argue about, will you have more or less grapes in Walla Walla, will the snowpack be less or higher? We weren't going to talk about that. We were simply going to look at what's the cost and what's the benefit to various ways to try to reduce carbon in Washington State. And I think once you move past the conversation about glaciers and those things into the economic forefront, a lot of people became very surprised at the economic impacts in Washington State. And I thought one of the most interesting things was when Senator Ranker wanted the consultant to study the issue of what if we do nothing? What if Washington State does nothing? What will happen to world climate? And he wanted that to be included. And the consultant looked at Senator Ranker and said, well, Senator, if you do nothing, nothing will change. And he was kind of dumbfounded by that response from our consultant, because the reality is, because we are such a low carbon producing state due to hydro and other aspects in Washington, really no matter what we do. So the question becomes, how can we work in a worldwide fashion to have cleaner energy? And one of the things as chairman of the Energy Committee I've been focused in on is what we call New Energy Thursdays, where we talk about ways that we can move Washington State forward to be a leader in new, cleaner technologies when it comes to how we put energy on the grid in Washington State. And my mantra always is without raising costs, which is always my caveat. Is there a way to put more energy on the grid in a cleaner fashion without raising costs? And those are the things that we've been trying to look at. Nuclear power could be an answer to our electric grid. Modular nuclear reactors. The federal government under the Obama administration is putting hundreds of millions of dollars into Oregon to create a permit for what are called modular nuclear reactors. If these come online, we can replace coal power with nuclear. It's a great thing for reducing carbon, if you care about that, and having cleaner air, if you care about that, and having a low-cost alternative, if you care about that. So I think what we need to be focused in on is our ways that we can do better in Washington. How can we be an innovation leader? One of the things you cannot do as a legislator is legislate technological advances. I can't write a law that says you will do better, you will invent this. We found that out at the federal level. I'll give one last stat. The federal government had a renewable fuel standard that said we're going to produce 1.7 billion gallons of cellulosic ethanol in 2013. 1.7 billion gallons, and I'll get to this really quick. We produced about 700,000 gallons of cellulosic ethanol in America during that time frame. To put that in perspective, that's 2 hours of operation at Washington State's 5 oil refineries. So we can set the target. We can't always mandate we achieve it, but what we should be doing is investing in research and development, pushing Washington State forward to be a leader in R&D and technology, and finding ways to put cleaner energy on the grid in a cost-effective fashion that'll promote job growth and take advantage of those things that are good for us in Washington State. So I'm looking forward to talking more about the governor's cap and trade proposal, and we will be having a public hearing on his cap and trade proposal in the Tri-Cities in September. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Okay, each panelist will now have 5 minutes for a response or a rebuttal, and then we will go to your questions. So be thinking about your questions, filling out those cards, fill out the front, write a question on the back, and as we are wrapping up the rebuttals, we'll start picking up those cards. And if you have a question, just write it on the back, and those will get to me, and we will get as many questions as we can. And we will go through back in the order that we started. So Dr. Bauman.
Super. So thank you all for excellent comments. I actually found a lot to agree on with a lot of folks on the panel, but especially one point was that it's hard to debate the governor's proposal because the governor doesn't have a specific proposal out there. So just to give you a sense of what a specific proposal looks like, I'll talk you through the proposal that a group that I'm with is talking about, which is let's have a BC-style carbon tax. So British Columbia has a carbon tax, carbon price, it's $30 per ton of CO2. So that's going to raise the price of gasoline by about 25 cents a gallon. What can we do with that kind of money in Washington State? We can cut the state sales tax by a full percentage point. A full percentage point, right? We can fund the working families rebate, which is going to offset impacts on low-income households, which is something Dan mentioned, and we can eliminate the B&O tax for manufacturers in the state of Washington. Right? So basically what this is going to do is you're going to pay a couple $100 more a year for fossil fuels. You'll pay a couple $100 less a year for everything else. Right, and on average for most households, as in British Columbia, it's going to work out okay. So specifically on impacts of the poor, what I'd like you to think about this as is, would you rather pay a carbon tax or would you rather pay sales taxes or business taxes? Because that's really the question that's in front of us. Would you rather pay a carbon tax or would you rather pay some of these other taxes? Right, so Dan mentioned impacts on the poor from a carbon tax. You could say the same thing about sales taxes. So if you make $130,000 a year in Washington State, you pay about 2% of your income in sales taxes to the state. If you make $45,000 a year, you pay about 4% of your income to the state. If you make $20,000 a year, you pay about 7% of your income to the state. So sales taxes are also regressive. So by eliminating a sales tax, we can help deal with some of the impacts of a carbon tax. There was a number of comments about the global perspective and what can Washington do. I agree with all of that, and I actually have something that I call I call it the 5 Chinas theory of the world, which says you can take the world population, which is 7 billion people, you divide by 5, you get 1.4 billion. That's about the population of China. So you can divide the world up into 5 chunks that are the size of China. So China, India is about the same size as China. Add up everybody else in Asia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Philippines, about the same population as China. So there's a lot of people in Asia. Right, so the future of the planet is going to be determined in Asia. The rich world is the 4th China. North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, put them all together, about the same population in China. And the 5th China is everybody else, principally Africa and South America. Right, at the beginning of this century, the rich world was responsible for about half of world CO2 emissions. And what we're seeing, one of the big stories of this century is going to be growth and development in poor countries around the world, which is going to be terrific. As Dan said, they're going to get access to electricity, transportation, healthcare, education, things that we take for granted. But I think the other big story this century is going to be dealing with the environmental impacts of having 7 billion people on this planet, growing to 10 or 11 billion people who are all trying to live the lifestyles that we have here. So I want to emphasize that no matter what we do, we are going to be playing with fire. I'm not going to doubt or deny that carbon pricing is it's a serious policy, right? If we mess it up, it's bad, right? We need to get it right. But if we don't do anything about climate change, we are also playing with fire, okay? Because potentially bad things could happen, right? So that's the second point I want to make, is that no matter what, we're going to be playing with fire. And I think if we're smart about it, we can do the right thing, we can reform our tax system, and we can improve the environment at the same time. The last point I want to make is just that I heard a lot from Dan and from Senator Ericksen about what they're against being cap and trade. I'm interested in hearing more about what they're for. Would they be for a policy like this? Would they be for some other policy? Are they just opposed to climate policy in general? Because I feel like there's a risk. There's a risk here that if there's a void, especially if folks on the right side of the political spectrum are just the party of no all the time, I think the risk there is that at some point you're gonna break without bending. Right? So I feel like a policy like what we're talking about here with revenue neutral carbon taxes, I feel like that's a pretty bipartisan friendly policy. We have folks on the conservative side of the political spectrum like Todd Myers of the Washington Policy Center, who's on our advisory council. We have support from economists across the political spectrum. So I think there are smart things that we can do about climate change. And I hope that folks who understand things about economics and care about market forces will take advantage and really step forward and come out in support of certain policies, as opposed to just criticizing policies. Final point I want to make, again, if you think about sales taxes, nickels and dimes kind of add up over the course of the year, right? So even a 1 percentage point reduction in the sales tax is going to save the average household, right? Retail sales tax for the average household, if you make $50,000 a year, you pay about $2,000 a year in sales taxes. My wife and I are thinking about buying a new car, right? $20,000 car, we're going to pay $2,000 in sales taxes. That would cover the amount of gas consumption for quite a long time. The refineries here in Bellingham pay about $100 million a year in B&O taxes. Think about how great it would be if they had to pay less B&O taxes and paid more in carbon taxes to help reduce our carbon emissions.
Thanks. Representative Fitzgibbon.
Great, thank you. And you're going to mainly hear us talking about the things that we disagree on, but I think it's also worth just pointing out going into this that there are a lot of things that I think everybody said that that I share and that are worth repeating. And Senator Ericksen's point about expanding use of nuclear power, I think that if we can find a way for nuclear power to pencil out, if we can do it in a way that we know is going to be safe and it doesn't have to be subsidized, I think that could be an important part of the mix as we figure out how to reduce carbon pollution emissions. Senator Ericksen talked about the renewable fuel standard, which was a Bush administration policy, which has been walked back by the Obama administration. It didn't work. It didn't work because it didn't take market forces into account. Instead of being about a specific goal like reducing carbon emissions, it said you need to produce X percent of corn ethanol, X percent of cellulosic ethanol, X percent biodiesel, and it didn't work. It was insensitive to the market forces, and it was a command and control approach, which isn't what we're talking about today. It's not what cap and trade is. It's not what carbon tax is. They're still government intervention in the economy, but they're ways that understand market forces and instead of try to find the cheapest ways to reduce emissions. And that's the policies, carbon tax, cap and trade that we're talking about, understand that, take that into account. So a couple things I did want to just respond to in particular. One of the questions that you get when talking about the value of reducing carbon emissions in Washington State is, what percent we are of total emissions. And it's true that Washington alone is not a huge percentage of global climate emissions. So why should we act? Well, if you think about the fact that we're not the only jurisdiction that's acting. British Columbia has a carbon tax. They're not the only place in the world that does. Chile has a carbon tax. Mexico just implemented for the first time a carbon tax. California, Quebec, the entire European Union, the northeastern states in the United States have cap and trade proposals. So when you add us to all of them, it starts to look like a pretty big chunk. China, a number of the provinces of China have looked at different approaches of reducing their carbon emissions. Some of them are looking at carbon tax, some of them are looking at cap and trade. Of course, China's a communist country, and they're gonna follow a more command and control approach. But they're starting to tell in the heavy coal producing regions of China, in part due to some of the pictures that Yoram showed you, but in part due because the leaders of China know as well as here that carbon pollution is going to cause big impacts on all of us. They're starting to say we need to reduce our emissions, and we get that. Now we can help show them how it's done here in Washington. You know, we don't export a lot of fossil fuels from Washington. We export a lot of ideas from Washington. Microsoft and other tech industries have exported ideas to China and to India and to Europe, around the world. If we can export the idea of this is how you reduce your emissions and this is how you grow your economy at the same time, that is something that we can do. A few of the other benefits, Mr. Simmons was talking about the costs, and there's no doubt that costs are a part of any transaction like this. The proceeds of selling carbon permits can be, under a cap and trade system, or the proceeds of revenue raised from carbon tax can be reinvested in our economy in any way that we as a people decide. If we decide to reduce taxes that are burdens on families and on businesses, we can do that. If we decide to invest in our infrastructure and grow our economy that way, our roads, that's something else we can do. If we decide to invest in our schools so we have the best educated workforce in the world, that's something that we can do too. I think there's a lot of people out there that would really like to see some of the most burdensome taxes that we have, our property tax, sales tax, business and occupation tax reduced. That's something that we can do if we get revenue from a carbon emissions reduction plan. Finally, those are not the only benefits. As we burn fewer fossil fuels, there are other benefits that are unrelated to climate change. So even if climate change is not something that you're particularly worried about, we're going to have cleaner air, we're going to have cleaner water. The biggest impacts to water quality in our state come from petroleum products being burned and then dripping and then being washed into our waterways every time it rains. There are a lot of reasons that we're going to have a cleaner and healthier environment, even if you decide that the climate science is a farce and you're not concerned about it. There are other benefits that our communities will have when we keep our dollars local, when we spend them on energy generated here in Washington and not burning dead dinosaurs from Saudi Arabia.
Thank you.
North Dakota.
Or North Dakota, yes. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Simmons.
Thank you. One of my real concerns when it comes to cap and trade or a carbon tax is how what happens in the real world. For example, just about 10 years ago, Senators Lieberman and McCain had a cap and trade proposal that was called the Climate Stewardship Act. It was 58 pages. When the Waxman-Markey bill was introduced in Congress in 2009, it was, the discussion draft was 600 pages. The bill that then, when it was introduced, was 932 pages. When it came out of committee, it was just over 1,000 pages, and then when it passed the House, it was 1,400 pages. Now, I don't doubt that the Washington state legislature is much better than than Congress when it comes to passing laws and making sure that they're not filled up with a whole bunch of crap. But how do you go from 58 pages to 1,400 pages? The problem is that in order to do that, there's a whole lot of buying off special interests. There's a whole lot of stuff in those bills that is completely inefficient, that is all about subsidies, that are things like the renewable fuel standard, as was mentioned, and that concerns me. One of the things that was mentioned is that we do have some examples of working cap and trade systems in the U.S. and in the world. One of those is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the northeastern states. If you look at what's happened with electricity prices, because the regional greenhouse gas emissions only deals with electricity in the Northeast, since the plan was introduced in 2005, we've seen the price of electricity increase 60% faster in New England than it has in the rest of the country. To put that in perspective, New York now has the second highest electricity cost in the country, higher than even Alaska. I mean, Alaska, with a tiny population, a gigantic area, should have expensive electricity, and they do. But New York has now surpassed them with the cost of electricity is over 20 cents a kilowatt hour in New York on average for residential users now. And you compare that to a place like Germany. The European Union has cap and trade, and Germany's electricity rates are now, I think they're about 30 cents a kilowatt hour, so nearly 5 times what they are here. And as a result of high electricity rates, Der Spiegel, which is not a right-of-center publication, said that, you know, electricity is becoming a luxury good, and that's the concern. Oh, and one more thing, Germany last year they built 10 new coal-fired power plants for 10 gigawatts of new coal. Their carbon dioxide emissions are increasing. Just because they might have a cap and trade system doesn't necessarily mean that they're abiding by it. And lastly, you know, I am very optimistic about the future if we just look at the past in terms of air pollution. There is an incredible success story. Since 1970, the GDP has more than doubled. The amount of vehicle miles traveled has more than doubled. The amount of energy that we use in the US is up about, I think, about 40% over that time period. And total pollution emissions, and this is sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, you know, pollution that is harmful to humans, has decreased by 72% over that time period. So that is a, well, thank you. I obviously did not have anything to do with it, but you know,
don't be modest.
Good, hardworking Americans figured out the technology, figured out pollution control technology, and if that has happened here, it will happen in other places. But the access to energy is critical, because energy is it's the most basic part. It's the most basic input into the economy, along with labor. So lastly, when it comes to climate change, I think it is far better and we are far able to adapt to any changes the richer we are, and that's why I think it is critical that we continue to grow the economy instead of stifle it with a cap and trade program. Thank you.
Senator.
Well, thank you. Yoram, I'm very impressed you brought PowerPoints for your rebuttal. You can tell you've done it a few times. You knew what it was going to be. It's like, you go to the slides. Here's my rebuttal. Go to the slides. I knew what you guys were going to say. One of the things you did bring up, though, in your rebuttal was this issue. It's the narrative, I think, that runs through the media, that somehow people who are not bought off on cap and trade are just saying no to everything. And I think in the legislature last year you saw the opposite, where we brought forward solid legislation on looking at how we can expand nuclear technology, bringing in people, look at new energy that we can bring online in Washington State, both of which were heavy lifts with my good friends across the aisle. The other one, which I thought was just fascinating, was we had a proposal on the table to convert Washington State's ferry fleet over from diesel to natural gas, LNG, which I was promoting heavily. And we had a proposal there that we could not get over the hump, you know, with our good friends across the aisle, which would reduce emissions and provide cleaner air and be a solution to get to what I call cleaner, better, faster, cheaper. You know, also when it comes to how we can move Washington State forward and on all these different issues. So I don't think it's simply a thing of saying, if I don't agree with the cap and trade proposal, that somehow I am just a no on everything. I think it's what the media tries to portray, but we have to move past that into how we can challenge ourselves to give people what they want, which is an increase in their quality of life at the same time while we're giving them cleaner sources of energy to move forward with. One of the things I think that we have to take a good hard look at is, if we're going to proceed in Washington State under a cap and trade or a carbon tax, which I'd like to talk about those two greater in the details, is how do I go to a person who has a manufacturing job in Washington State and I say, because of the cap and trade or our carbon tax, I am going to export your job to China to reduce my carbon emissions by 25% by 2020, But oh, by the way, China's going to increase their carbon production by the same time and take your job and manufacture it over there and then ship it back to you in Washington State to be able to use. You know, I represent constituents, and we live in Reelsville, and we try to, you know, go out there and talk to people how I'm going to protect your jobs, but how do you explain that to a person? If you're not going to get worldwide carbon reduction, I'm going to sacrifice your job and your quality of life and your chance to send your kids to college because I want to have an artificial reduction in carbon. I think that's where we have to get to. You mentioned the thing about, you know, party of no and how do you stop everything. I know the mantra. The easiest way to kill a bill in Olympia is not to bring in special interest groups and to line up the money and let them shoot at each other. The easiest way to kill a bill in Olympia is simply to ask the question, how does this work on the ground? And so you operate in the theoretical. You know, we can operate in the theoretical, and I'd love to have a debate on cap and trade versus carbon tax, right? That's a great theoretical conversation to have. But when you actually say, well, then how do I go and implement that on the ground? What does that look like? I spent way too much time on Governor Gregoire's climate action team. And that was a design to be able to create a cap and trade for Washington. And what we found was every single industry group sitting around that table was pursuing their special interest, which was they wanted credits for sequestering carbon in the wood inside a home they were building. They wanted credit for being able to do X, Y, Z, you know, for using a different plowing technique on their fields to be able to sequester. And they wanted credit for that. You create such a complex system that the amount of money it takes to run that as a government eats up all this productivity and energy that you could be putting into other areas. So I think the interesting debate to have at some point would be cap and trade versus carbon tax. Not saying I support either, you know, but I mean, that is really the philosophical debate. When you talk about Todd Meyer from the Washington Policy Center, when he talks about the issue, he talks about carbon tax. And if you want to do one, that's the fairest way. You just have a level one and everybody goes out there and fights it out. You don't try to pick winners and losers through cap and trade. The other part that I always hear constantly running through this debate about cap and trade or carbon tax is it generates revenue for the government. And that's taxes from the people that goes to the government. You know, it's a different way of taking the tax dollars to get to them. And I'll close with this one. And how it gets so complicated. Initiative 937, people will say we haven't seen an increased energy cost due to Initiative 937. There are two reasons for that. One is 937 was implemented during a recession when energy consumption went down. The second one is wind power in Washington State is subsidized to such a huge degree by the federal government, which they're borrowing from China to subsidize the windmills with. If you take away the federal subsidies and pass that cost directly onto the ratepayer, all of a sudden you see a massive spike in the power rates of those people. Not saying wind is bad, but we have to find ways to make it work in a cost-effective fashion. And that's where cap and trade allows you to hide, pick winners and losers, and manipulate the system to a point that I think becomes counterproductive in many ways, more than being a productive tool to accomplish shared goals of cleaner energy that's affordable to people of Washington State. So.
Okay, now comes the fun part of the program. I have folks walking around picking up cards with questions, and please again fill the front side out either way, fill the back out if you have a question. We actually, our social media guru, John has been asking people what they think on Facebook. So I have a couple questions from Facebook to get us started off here. We are high tech here at this debate. I have a question from Ron Peters about the effect of cap and trade on business, and let me throw both of these Facebook questions out, and then panelists can decide what they want to address. Actually, it looks like both of them are about business and jobs. So the question, I think, is to Senator Erickson's point. I guess I'll throw this over here to our panelists who are in favor. What would the cost in jobs be? And I think Senator Ericksen mentioned at least a shift in jobs, right? Even under a carbon tax, some industries would suffer even under a revenue carbon tax, I think. So if Representative Fitzgibbon, you want to start off answering that?
Sure. Just remind me how long I have.
90 seconds.
Do we have 90 seconds? I think it's 90
Great.
seconds, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So again, you know, as we've said, Governor Inslee doesn't have a proposal on the table for us to consider on cap and trade. They're going to be developed over the course of this year, and then we'll give it a full airing in the legislative session like we would any bill. I think that Senator Ericksen asked a really good question. What do you say to somebody whose job is shipped overseas because of a cap and trade bill? You could just as well ask, and I think that we should ask. I think we should, as a state and as policymakers, ask. What if your job is shipped overseas because the manufacturing business and occupation tax is too high, and we could have eliminated it with revenue from a carbon tax or a cap and trade proposal? If the business and occupation tax is driving jobs out of state, which a lot of folks will say that it is, are there other ways that we could instead pay for our state government instead to pay for our schools? I think that's a question worth asking too. There are a lot of folks who would say that businesses have left the state because of various costs, that families have left the state because property taxes are high, because sales tax are high. So I think any decision we make about taxation is going to have some positive impacts and some negative impacts. And I think one of the reasons that I think it's worth considering reducing our carbon emissions is that we can find a way to use the revenue from any program like that to help keep jobs in the state by reducing other costs, other taxes.
We're going to get a round of applause after everything we say tonight. This is terrific. So I'll just say, first of all, we believe that with our proposal, and again, I'm talking about the specifics here just because it's nice to have a specific proposal to talk about, that businesses, manufacturing businesses in particular, which are the ones that are going to be relatively hard hit by carbon pricing, will, on aggregate, will pay less in carbon tax than they currently pay in B&O tax. Will pay less in carbon tax than they currently pay in B&O tax. Right? So I think there's a strong case to be made that we can increase manufacturing jobs in Washington State and show the way for the rest of the world about how to do this. The other point I'll bring up on this issue is I went and talked to some folks actually who are involved in RGGI out on the East Coast, the cap and trade system they have out there, and they use some of the money from their cap and trade system to fund energy efficiency projects in the state and for local businesses. And what they said, I talked to a smart economist out there at Colby College who helped design this program. And what he said was that local businesses were using that revenue when they go and talk to their national and international headquarters who are trying to decide, hey, which plant should we shut down? Should we shut down the plant in Maine or should we shut down the plant in Arizona? And because they have this pool of money that comes from the cap and trade system, they are choosing to shut down the plant in Arizona, which is great for the plant in Maine, which is where these people are. So I think that there's a case to be made that in Washington State, having something like that here could actually boost manufacturing, create jobs in Washington State, if we are smart about it.
You know, really quick on that one, I appreciate it, right? But I love economists because they turn the dials and the numbers are all over the place. But it's like energy. You can't put, if we could find a way to put in less energy and get more energy out, we'd be done talking. I can't put in less tax dollars and get more tax dollars out. So if I'm going to have a carbon tax on manufacturing, I can't say you're going to pay less because you can't pay less in taxes and do all the things you want to do, you want to fund with your carbon tax if you're paying less in taxes for producing the same amount of carbon. I mean, it doesn't work that way. It's going to be a tax increase. You can't take out less and get more out of it when it comes to taxation out of these manufacturers, just like it doesn't have with energy.
I have a question here that is actually something I was wondering about because I saw a news headline, and the question is about the Australian cap and trade program, which I think the latest headline was they're ending after 5 years. So, Yoram, it looks like you have something to say about that.
I don't think, no. Don't do what Australia did. That's what I have to say.
What did they do though? That sort of the question was, what happened in Australia? Why didn't it work? What were they trying that was different?
Well, so there are a whole lot of political issues there as well with changes of leadership and things like that in Australia. But their underlying proposal was they were going to have a carbon tax and then gradually shift it to a cap and trade system. And the fundamental problem I think that happened in Australia was that the Prime Minister at the time, Julia Gillard, I think her name was, campaigned on an I'm not going to implement a carbon tax platform. And then she became Prime Minister and implemented a carbon tax. So when you lie to people, they don't like that. That has nothing to do with a carbon tax, though. That has to do with people lying.
So there are a lot of questions here about, I think, Dr. Bauman, you hit a nerve, because there are a lot of questions about the idea of a carbon tax and whether government would actually reduce other taxes. And I think maybe I'll split that into two. Yeah, there are a lot of questions here about that.
Let's do it.
I'm working to find other questions that aren't about that. So I mean, I think there's sort of a historical question. How did they do it in BC? And then, you know, I guess one thing I'll throw in that's just a personal observation. Oftentimes when people talk about tax reductions, people put it this way: show me a tax you're going to completely eliminate, because that's the only guarantee that the rates won't just come back up. So maybe if you want to grab that one, but like I say, a lot of people here, that is a big issue for them.
Fair enough. We'll talk about it. I'll say a couple of things. So one is, I feel like underlying those sorts of concerns is, it comes pretty close to questioning sort of whether or not you have faith in democracy. Right? Because ultimately the question, ultimately the question is, right, are they the government going to reduce other taxes, right? Well, they, the government, is we, the government, right? We, the people, we the people are not, so in that case, I mean, I think Bob Inglis probably says it best, which is that we should just go back to having a monarchy. Right? So that's one thing I'll say. Apparently that argument didn't work, so I'll try the next argument. In British Columbia, the way they did it was, one, they had a right-of-center government that was in power that did it. Two, they have a specific piece in the legislation that says that every year the finance minister has to report how much money came in from the carbon tax, how much tax reductions went out on the other side. And if the amount of money that went out on the other side is less than the amount of money that came in from the carbon tax, if the government is taking extra money, then the finance minister loses her salary for the year. So that's part of how they did it in British Columbia. Now, here's a question for those of you who are doubting this. I mean, first of all, you can write legislation to, you know, reduce taxes. So I feel like it is possible to do that. Right? I will ask you the following question. When was the last time the state sales tax rate was changed in Washington State? When was the last? So it's currently 6.5%. When was the last time it was changed in Washington State? Anybody? 1983. 1983. The last thing I'll say about this is, if you want a tax to reduce and you're looking at something like a 1.7, or excuse me, a tax to eliminate, because that was the question, Trent, like what tax could you totally get rid of? Carbon tax, like in BC, you could totally eliminate the state portion of the property tax. State portion of the property tax is about a quarter of the total property tax. You could eliminate the state portion of the property tax.
I hate that 1983 number, because that's John Spellman, the last time we had a Republican governor. He did the food tax on sales tax. It didn't work out so good for the party.
I'll make a few points about carbon tax and why. It just comes down to this. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of any time the government wants to implement a completely new tax. Taxes have a way of not decreasing, but of continually increasing. No matter what we think of democracy, that has just been the course of taxation for decades now. So I'm very skeptical of a new tax. And I'm skeptical of the carbon tax in the real world, and the potential, like we can reduce certain taxes, have a new have a new carbon tax. I'm just concerned that those other taxes are going to stay reduced. So it sounds like they might have done some good things in BC, and good for them, but color me skeptical. And if it's possible to reduce taxes, then why don't we do it more often?
Try really quick on the British Columbia example. One thing to keep in mind about the BC economy, and some folks can speak to it. I mean, go to Coquitlam these days compared to what Coquitlam was 15 years ago. You look at the massive influx of immigration, which is driving the economy. In British Columbia, it's going gangbusters up there, but the growth rate is phenomenal in BC also. So, and I think the Gordon Campbell administration really opened up the natural resources outside the lower mainland region to also drive the economy. So the timber and mining industries in BC are also been growing along with that immigration influx into the lower mainland to drive the economy. So while the carbon tax didn't slow it down apparently up there in BC, I think there are a lot of other elements that are really driving that BC economy forward that are very unique to that region in this period of time.
Can I respond very briefly?
Yeah.
So one thing I'd say here is, you mentioned that the timber industry was doing well in BC. The timber industry in BC is not doing well. The reason why they implemented this carbon tax was because of an outbreak of mountain pine beetle connected to climate change that's doing bad things to the timber industry in British Columbia. That's why a right-of-center government implemented a climate policy and got serious about climate policy. The last thing I'll say just about taxes is, if you actually look at state and local government tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, it's been 15% basically for decades. If you look at federal government tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, it's been roughly 20% of GDP for decades. What's been growing is regulations. The way to avoid more regulations about climate change is to have smart policy that involves putting a price on carbon.
Okay, let me throw a curveball question out here that came in from the audience, but it was referenced by the speakers, and that is about nuclear energy more generally. But I'll read the question as it's written. Since 2005, all new nuclear reactors in the U.S. have been 100% subsidized. Why are market forces so opposed to nuclear power? But I think this is a great. I mean, Washington State is a state that has a nuclear reactor in it, and so I think thoughts on nuclear power and the degree to which that is an answer to this question, I think would be great to hear from all the panelists. Maybe we can start down here.
Wow, great, lucky me. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind about nuclear power for me, I think when I think about nuclear power and I contrast it with, for example, coal-fired power, nuclear power can go horribly, horribly wrong, as we saw in Fukushima, as we saw in Chernobyl, as we've seen too many times. Coal goes horribly, horribly wrong when you use it exactly as intended. Exactly as intended, it's increased the carbon in the atmosphere and it's making our world a more dangerous place. So for that reason, I don't think that nuclear is the panacea, but I think that it is a step in the right direction. However, it is important to keep in mind, if you're somebody who's concerned about government involvement in the economy, that the reason we have nuclear power is because the federal government provides them massive insurance for free, and because the nuclear industry was initiated by heavy, heavy federal investment in research and development back in the 1940s and 50s, and which continues to this day, but that's when it really got off the ground. So government picking winners and losers, been doing that for a long time. Government has done that pretty much since the beginning of time. That's nuclear power has been a really big winner that government has chosen. Can it pencil out? Can market forces make it pencil out? Haven't seen that yet. I'm open to it. I know that Senator Ericksen is interested in that and wants to see more research in that. And if I can see it pencil out, then I think it could be a really important part of our energy mix in the future. Haven't quite seen that.
Yeah, let me just go down the line.
I'm happy to let nuclear compete with other technologies on a level playing field. I'm an economist.
I definitely agree with that. One of the real challenges with nuclear is just the regulatory structure. I wish I could remember. I believe there's a nuclear power plant in Connecticut. They had just finished the first unit before 3 Mile Island. The second unit that they built at the same power plant was twice as expensive as the first one. The only difference was one happened before 3 Mile Island, the other one happened after 3 Mile Island. And so the cost structure for nuclear is out of whack. There's no long-term repository for spent nuclear fuel. There's just a lot of regulatory challenges for nuclear. I like nuclear, but it is it definitely has regulatory challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe, one of the things I think we kind of go back and forth on is there a role of government? In all this, and we've been sitting here singing the praises of Washington State's low carbon footprint, which is due to the government building dams. So there's a role of government in this whole process. And one of the things I think we really agreed about during the CLUE process was research and development into all these areas of technology, whether it be cellulosic ethanol, nuclear energy, new types of biofuels that can power our airplanes. And that's where dollars need to be going from the state to our universities to encourage R&D to put better products on the table. I think that's an important way to spend it. Is nuclear subsidized? Can we get rid of the Carter era rule about you can't reuse your spent nuclear material and keep recycling that through? I mean, there are lots of things I think we can do to move forward. And nuclear is one of those things I almost on occasion use as a litmus test on the climate change issue. Because if you truly believe all of the things you read about the dire consequences of climate change and yet you're still opposed to nuclear, it would seem to me that a technology that we're able to use safely in our Navy every single day, you know, to power fleets and to power cities, must be safer than the dire consequences that are predicted due to climate change. So if you're against nuclear and also saying, you know, you're worried about all these other things, I kind of wonder what you're actually driving here on the cap and trade proposal.
I think we passed your litmus test, yeah?
There we go. Well, good deal.
Did we?
You like nuclear?
I'm cool with it.
As someone who lives in Bremerton and looks out my back window at various nuclear reactors, that resonates with me. Another question from the audience. I'll just read it as it is here, and somebody can jump on it. Why propose a carbon tax instead of a mass green jobs program to move quickly from fossil fuels to hydroelectric, wind, solar, etc. entirely? So entirely get out of fossil fuels. Is that possible? What about green jobs? What about all that as an alternative to cap and trade or carbon tax? It's a question from the audience. So,
I can start. It's expensive, and it requires massive subsidies. There's a reason that we use. There's a reason that we use a lot of gasoline. There's a reason that we use a lot of diesel. It is convenient. We have the infrastructure. It just works. Like, I know that if if I go anywhere in this country that I can get there in my car. I know that there's going to be a gas station, for example. Completely changing that system is incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult. When you look at, we commissioned a study a few years ago that looked at the situation in Europe, particularly Spain, with their subsidies for wind and solar. And what the study found is that the subsidies were so great that 2.2 jobs were lost as a result for each green job created. And the reason for that, which should actually be a rather intuitive answer, is that the money to pay for these more expensive sources of electricity generation had to come from somewhere. Existing coal-fired power plants are some of the cheapest power there is. It's very close whether what is cheaper, existing coal or large hydro. And that's it. Everything else is more expensive. Building new solar, building new wind is far more expensive. And so switching to those sources, you're switching to higher cost, which means that if you're shutting down low cost and moving to high cost energy, that's going to cost you jobs because it's going to cost you money. That money has to come from somewhere.
Anything else?
I'll briefly chime in and say two things. One, coal is cheap only if you don't count the external costs associated with human health impacts. And as a good economist, I support internalizing those externalities. So we should keep those on the books, even though that's not something that companies actually pay, but it's something they should pay. And that's the point of carbon pricing, is to internalize externalities. The second thing I'll say is about the proposal, about the green jobs proposal. I think it's one of those things that sounds great in theory, but I don't know how many pages that legislation would be, and no disrespect to the legislators on the panel, but the state government is not necessarily all that smart, right? And so I feel like we should try to keep things simple. So a proposal to create green jobs sounds great in practice, but how do you do it in theory? What actually is a green job? I got some cardboard boxes the other day, and it said that they were manufactured in a green jobs. They were creating green jobs to make cardboard boxes. I mean, maybe that's true. I don't know. But so I feel like there's concerns that I have about how to actually make that happen in the real world.
Thank you. A couple questions about Europe. One says in Europe, carbon exchanges have been fraught with corruption, and Europe continues to increase its carbon emissions. A related question to that says the USA did not sign the Kyoto protocols, yet met them in 2013 using private sector exploration and natural gas production. Why legislate cap and trade? Again, I think there are two questions. What has been going on in Europe? I know a lot of people, I think, believe that Europe has been sort of leading the way on this. Is that a lot of hot air? There were stories just recently about, and I think Mr. Simmons mentioned this, about Germany burning more coal. What is the state of things in Europe? What can we learn from what has happened and is happening over there?
Well, a few comments. One, in Spain, in Germany, the costs of setting up their, they tried very hard to switch to solar and to switch to wind, and the systems that they set up were not very well set up, and as a result, Spain has what they call a rate deficit of billions of dollars, in that there's billions of dollars that are owed to the generators, to the wind generators, to the solar generators, that the taxpayers haven't paid yet, and that's a real problem. The same sort of thing is happening in Germany. It is incredibly expensive to switch a very large percentage of your electricity generation from from a system that currently works to new sources that are like wind and solar, that only works when when the wind blows, when the sun shines. That entails additional costs, and that is very expensive. And I had some other point, and I'm sure it was absolutely brilliant, and I can't think of it.
So I think Yoram was right about the legislature, and if it weren't for me and Joe, we never get anything done down there. So, one thing, on the cap and trade issue, one of the hard parts about this whole process, and we found this out during the Climate Legislative Executive Work Group, how big the task was we were trying to do to bring in all these models and analyze them for economic cost-benefit analysis, and what's going on in Australia, what's going on in Europe, what's working, what's not working. It was a huge task that we tried to do in a short period of time, and I think that was one of the frustrations that came through. But one of the things we also found, I'll give you a Washington State example, because people want to grab onto numbers. So the folks from Great Britain were here, and they were talking about their cap and trade program has reduced carbon emissions by 25%. So I was inundated with emails from people sending me stats, about not true, yes, true, and it floods into the office every time one of these stories comes out. But I'll give you an example about one of the things we struggle with in trying to calculate these things. In Washington State, our only coal-fired plant at TransAlta down in Centralia is scheduled to shut down in 2025. Now, do we count that as a CO2 reduction? Good question, right? Is that a CO2 reduction in Washington State? Well, in the clue, we didn't count it as a carbon reduction, though some of us were advocating to count it, because some of the power is sold out of state, so we couldn't count that. And then in theory, that's going to be replaced with a 1,200 megawatt gas-fired turbine, so you got to throw those back on top. So even though Washington State is going through this process of shutting down its only coal-fired plant, somehow that didn't generate into a carbon reduction in Washington State because of the way that we did the dials, to calculate what carbon reduction actually means. So that's one of the problems we get into in this whole process of cap and trade. If I'm going to lower it here, it comes up over here. How do you get a good mechanism to measure that makes it fair, so we actually know if we are having success or if we're not having success? And we ran into this also when we kept asking the question, if we don't do anything in Washington State, are we going to meet 2020 goals because of the TransAlta shutdown, because of higher CAFE standards, because 6 or 5 aluminum smelters that were operating in 1990 are not operating in 2020. All these different things you've got to take into account on the dials. And how do you get a good number that we can actually say, yes, that's accurate, no, that's not accurate? And that's one of the great troubles we have. Even the fundamentals of the process becomes complicated. And I think that's one of the things that diverts positive energy away from that bigger goal of cleaner energy that's affordable to the public going forward and how we make those investments. But it's one of those things we'll continue to struggle with through the process.
I remember the question had Kyoto. Mm-hmm. There was a Kyoto question. I don't think we've quite met what would have been our reductions if we had signed the Kyoto Protocol. We're kind of close. I mean, that is due to the dramatic increase of the use of natural gas. The U.S. is the world's largest natural gas producer. In fact, we produce more natural gas than the entire Middle East combined, which is, a pretty cool statistic, I think. And because we have a large amount of low-cost natural gas, using natural gas instead of coal has led to a reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. The economy has also been the other reason. An economy that is not doing all that well, the amount of vehicle miles traveled has actually fallen since about 2007, 2008. That's led to a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, and we're not using our electricity has not our use of electricity hasn't increased all that much either. So those are the factors that have led us to where we're actually close to meeting our Kyoto commitments if we would have actually made them.
So one aspect of the question was what's going on in Europe, and that's a broad question. Europe has more people in it than the United States. There's 500 million people there, and 40-some countries. In Germany, they have very expensive electricity. There's no denying that. Germany has a policy called the feed-in tariff, which subsidizes solar producers very heavily, and it has made electricity expensive there. It's Germany. If you look at a globe, we often ask, right, it's north of us. They're quite a bit north of us. We often wonder in Western Washington, where it's not generally that sunny, is this really a good place for solar? Well, Germany has gone to pretty heavy utilization of solar, even though they're way north of us, and it's cloudy there too. So I don't know that Germany's necessarily the country I would look to, but Senator Ericksen mentioned the UK, and UK's had a really interesting experience. So across the European Union, they have implemented a cap and trade program. They implemented it, more than a decade ago. They were the early adopters, and oftentimes you'll find if you're the first person to buy an iPad, it has a lot of kinks in it, and they've worked out a lot of the kinks. The permits were undersold. There were a lot of problems with the implementation of that. But some of the countries that have implemented it have done better than others. In the UK, they've got an interest. You're talking about carbon tax versus cap and trade. In the UK, what they have is they have a hybrid. They have the Europe-wide cap and trade proposal, and they have a carbon tax, which is a floor for the price of the permits. And they say, we want to make sure that this is working. And so if the permits dip the cost too much, like they have in other parts of Europe, they say, we're going to have this floor. It was implemented by not by their old Labour Party government, or their left to center government. It's now being maintained and expanded by their current conservative government, and it's not a partisan issue there. They say we all agree that this is something we have to do. We have different approaches on how we're going to do it. The conservative government says they want to expand fracking, and they want to pursue more market-based approaches, and the Labour Party wanted to do more centralized approaches, and that's just a disagreement they have. But they've all agreed this is something that we're going to do something about, and they've reduced their emissions by a great deal.
I think one thing that we learned from Europe, I think one thing that we learned from everywhere that we look is that we should try to keep it simple. And the simplest climate policy in the world is in our neighbor to the north, is in British Columbia. It works, it's a great policy. We could talk more about what Europe does or doesn't do right. I'm not a huge fan of it. But we should look at success stories, and there's a success story right next door.
Okay, well, we are going to move to closing statements here. And in proper debate fashion, since the gentlemen on the left here are advocating for the proposal, we're going to go in the opposite order that we started, and so we will start with Senator Ericksen down there, and 5 minutes apiece for closing statements.
I don't know if I got 5 minutes of material left in me for the closing statement.
Actually, I'm being reminded it's supposed to be 3 minutes, but we'll give them 3.5.
I'm not sure if I got that much. I just want to say I appreciate you all coming out here for this important discussion about energy future in Washington State. One of the big things about it is, last year when that Skagit River Bridge fell down, one of the things we learned about transportation infrastructure is if a bridge falls down, you can set up a detour and drive around it while we fix it. And we did that effectively and got it up and running again. When you're talking about energy grids and power sources that are so fundamental to our daily lives, if a grid goes down, you can't survive for 2 days, let alone 3 weeks as you try to put it back together. The one question we heard today about, why not just transition immediately to solar and wind and create all these green jobs? We have to invent how to do that. You need technology, and legislation and legislators cannot mandate the technology be invented. The grid is a very complicated piece of equipment, and to keep energy on the grid, which is so vital to everything we do in our daily lives, is not a simple thing to keep up and operating. So as we move forward, that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind. We need to have an energy vision for the future that's based in the realities of today. And realities of today, I believe, include fossil fuels going forward. It'll be more natural gas being put on the grid, moving to newer energies, hopefully moving to nuclear energy that'll work to keep baseload energy on the grid, and we should be focused in on that. There are two conversations here tonight. One is the how, right, if you want to reduce carbon. The other one, I think, is the why. And I think we spent most of the evening talking about the how. What would be a better way to do it? We haven't talked too much about why in Washington State should we be the ones leading the charge on this in terms of actually reducing carbon when we're such a low carbon producing state already. I think we can be a leader in technology. We can invest in research and development. We can talk about ways that we can have cleaner energy, which is what we do in America, what we should be doing. How can we have a better way to produce it and put it on the grid? That's a good conversation to have. But to say that we're going to artificially lower carbon to meet artificial caps and put thousands and thousands of hardworking Washingtonians out of work simply to shift those jobs and those carbon emissions to China or India or Vietnam or wherever else they go to is not a good solution going forward. And it's easy to talk about in the theoretical, but the on the ground is what we have to be concerned about in Washington State to make it work. And that's the concerns that I have when we're looking at these proposals. We'll continue working on it. We'll continue bringing people together to talk about ideas and solutions on how we can move people forward in Washington. Because I agree, no is not an answer in the legislative process, except when it comes to certain tax increases. But looking for solutions to move forward, I think, is the critical thing. And we need to be innovative, and we need to be leaders, and we need to invest in research and development. And those are the kind of things I think we should be focused in on Washington State. The cap and trade proposal, my concern and why I oppose cap and trade in general, though we haven't seen the governor's details of his special plan for Washington, is that it artificially creates winners or losers. It puts too much power into the government to manipulate markets. And that's the kind of power I agree with you, Yoram. I don't trust the legislature to have. I don't think that the legislature, as a part-time capacity, is equipped to be making those decisions, and to put too much power into the executive branch and tell them just to do it is disconcerting to me. So thanks for being here. It's good to see you all, and I appreciate you taking time.
Again, thank you for coming out tonight. I care passionately about energy. It's what it's my career. It's what I do. It's what I think about every day. Energy is the lifeblood of the economy, and I think it's critical that we don't screw it up, because when we do screw it up, it is the results can be catastrophic. Maybe not for every member of society, in fact not for every member of society, but it will be for a lot of middle income and low income families if we artificially increase the cost of energy. They're the people that bear the brunt more than upper income families, and I'm very concerned about that. As Senator Ericksen said earlier, we are in the middle of an energy revolution in the United States. We are the world's largest natural gas producer. We are the #2 oil producer in the world. Probably by next year, we'll be the #1 oil producer in the world. When we think about things such as oil or natural gas, and also coal for that matter, people just a few years ago thought that those sources of energy were not the future, because that was old technology. The reason that the hydraulic fracturing revolution is happening, the reason that we're producing a lot more oil, is because of high technology, and it's high technology that is in oil exploration and natural gas exploration and development. It's hydraulic fracturing that is literally getting oil out of a rock, out of natural gas, out of a rock. People have known that it was there for years, but couldn't figure out how to extract it, and they can today, which I think is pretty incredible. The technology that they use, they're able to directionally drill miles down, and then at some point decide, oh, we're going to now go with this, you're 3 miles down, and then they decide to go 5 miles horizontally. That is incredible, especially because a couple miles from the drilling rig, they're able to hit something the size of a phone booth, and that's all because of high technology. So we don't know what the future holds for technology, but the way that we are best able to achieve it is if we have the money to achieve it, if we don't artificially restrict our economy, if the richer we are, the cleaner we are. That is part of the story that we've experienced over the last 30, 40 years with air quality. Air quality is better today than it's been since EPA has been keeping track, and that's a fantastic story. So, I'm optimistic about the future because I believe in America, I believe in American technology, and the last thing that I want is to artificially increase the cost of energy because of the harm that I believe that it will occur throughout the economy. Thank you.
So I want to echo my panelists in thanking you all for coming out tonight and spending the evening with us. I'm heartened to see how much we agree on. And I do think there's a lot of common ground. And I think that's really terrific in terms of where we could be heading going forward. I also want to, we haven't talked a whole lot about climate science this evening, but I do want to emphasize that I think part of the agreement is that there's a widespread agreement that carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas. There's widespread agreement that humans have been increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. There's widespread agreement that global temperatures have been increasing for the last 100 years. There's widespread agreement that humans contribute something to that. And most scientists, the IPCC, a lot of the scientific consensus is that it's very likely that humans have contributed most of the temperature increase over the last 50 years. That's maybe something that we could disagree on. I know reputable scientists who question that, but the first 4 points, that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, humans are increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, temperatures have been going up, humans contribute something to that. That should be something that we could all, hopefully, that we have reached a national consensus on. So that's one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is we've only managed to kind of touch the surface of this issue tonight, and as a good capitalist, I want to suggest a way that you can learn a little bit more about this, which is to buy my books. So I have a couple of cartoon economics books. People like Greg Mankiw, the chair of the Harvard Economics Department, one of Mitt Romney's chief economic advisors, says that it's a good book. And we actually have a new book that's coming out. It's called The Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change. It's so new, it's not officially out in bookstores, but I have some in the trunk of my car. If you want any of these books, I'll sell them to you like drugs outside. I take credit cards. I'm happy to make money from you. And they're pretty great books. They have plugs from everybody from Jim Hansen to the American Enterprise Institute's gentleman there, Kevin Hassett. The last thing I want to say, and there's how to get a hold of me if you're interested in talking more with me about anything. The last thing I want to say is, and you're going to love this, I've been thinking a lot lately, and I encourage you to think about what are the lessons for climate change? What are the lessons from Obamacare? Okay. What can we learn about the climate debate from Obamacare? And I think that there are two lessons here. I think there's a lesson for the left, and I think there's a lesson for the right. The lesson for the left is keep it simple. Right? Keep it simple. The government is not super smart about doing all sorts of complicated things. Right? So that's the lesson for the left. The lesson for the right, I would argue, is that sometimes it's better to bend than to break. So if you're going to oppose legislation, it's better to come forward with an alternative, maybe compromise, that sometimes you got to do that in a democracy and just say, instead of just saying no to things. I'm not talking about small pieces like nukes or changing the ferries. I'm talking about an economy-wide policy that's going to move us forward in reducing carbon emissions. I think we have a terrific example to the north in British Columbia. We can do that here in Washington State in a way that's going to cut carbon emissions. It's going to create jobs in Washington State. It's going to be good for our economy. That's proven to have happened in British Columbia. We can do that here. I hope that folks on both sides of the political spectrum can get behind a policy like that.
Thanks once again. It's been a great discussion, and I think it speaks a lot for you, your willingness to sit and listen to the four of us go on about these things for a couple hours. I want to echo something that Daniel said about being an optimist. I think that that's really important, especially with predictions of what can happen if nothing is done about climate change. It's easy to think this is too big of a problem for us to solve, and maybe it's just something I should try to not think about very much. I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about our ability to solve it. And one of the things that I look back to is something else that Daniel referred to, the fact that our sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, some of the pollutants that were a real concern back in the 60s, 70s, 80s when environmental regulation first came down, the fact that those are now at their lowest level since we've ever been keeping track. That's in large part because in 1990, a Republican idea from a Republican president passed through a Democratic Congress, and that was a cap-and-trade program for sulfur dioxide. You don't hear a lot about acid rain anymore. When I was a little kid, which was a long time ago, the acid rain was like the thing we were really worried about, and I remember thinking, yeah, that's scary every time it rained, which it did a lot. You don't hear about that anymore. We solved that problem. We solved it. We capped sulfur dioxide emissions, allowed the trading of the permits to emit sulfur dioxide among power plants and industry, and they got it down to a safe level, and it's not something that we worry about anymore. I think we can deal with climate change, and we can deal with it in a way that grows our economy because we've done it before, and we're going to do it again, and I believe that we have the power to do that. So thank you.
Thanks. Well, this brings us almost to the close of our program. I think this has been a tremendous exchange, and you know, I'll admit that as I walked in here and sat down, I really wondered, are we going to have a conversation or not, right? I mean, we all know these are issues that people feel really strongly about, and I'm very excited that I think, I mean, frankly, I heard a lot of new ideas. I hope everyone else did as well. And one of the things that I always think about in a debate context like this, and that I want to leave us with before I give away some free stuff, is you know, in the business of policy, I guess I have a luxury that a couple of our panelists have, and the panelists in politics probably have a little bit less, right? Of being able to really think about these problems and not. I think that the challenge in politics is you wind up very committed to these things, and you know, you're on record and people follow you around with cameras, and I'm sure both of our panelists up here have had that experience. But for all of us, and especially for all of you in the audience who were listening like I was, the question I always ask myself is what have I not thought about? And I think there were a lot of ideas up here that I hadn't thought about before. I think Senator Ericksen mentioned a number of policy options in Washington State that you know, whether it's the ferries or small nuclear or all of these things, that it's important to not force ourselves into a binary context where it is yes or no, this or that. There are a lot of options in public policy, and I always ask myself the question: what would it take for me to change my mind about something? And I think that is perhaps the right question to ask. The Freedom Foundation is very glad that all of you are here. We have brochures outside. We hope that you'll be connected with us, that you'll take advantage of our resources, work with us on the issues on which we agree, and we're just glad that you're here. And will you join me right before I give away some copies of the state constitution and iTunes cards? If you turn in your cards, and if you still have a card, wave it around, somebody will run it up to me. But will you join me one last time in thanking our four outstanding panelists?